The winter that year arrived like an uninvited guest who had no intention of leaving. Snow had been falling for weeks without pause, burying the narrow trails that wound down from the northern hills toward Elderglen. My small farm sat higher than most, exposed to every wind that swept across the ridges. The stone house held the cold inside its walls no matter how many logs I fed the hearth. The gray-coated cattle huddled together in the barn, and the two old horses stood with their heads low, breathing steam into the frozen air. I moved through the days with the same quiet rhythm I had followed for years. Feed the animals, check the fences, split wood, eat alone. People in the valley called me the solitary herdsman on the snowy hill. I never corrected them. That winter, the emptiness inside the house felt heavier than before. I had planned to spend the festival the way I always did. Build a fire, warm a mug of apple cider, and eat the hard bread and salted meat I kept for such nights. Yet the silence pressed harder against my ears than in previous years. There was no one to hear if I spoke, no footsteps on the floorboards, no small voices asking questions. I told myself it was only the season, that the long nights always made solitude more noticeable. Still, the feeling remained. One afternoon, I rode down to the trading post to exchange hay for salt. The wind cut through my cloak, and the snow had already begun to drift across the road. Inside the low building, the woman behind the counter spoke while she measured the salt into a sack. She mentioned a family living at the far end of the Eastern Valley, an Orc woman and her 2 children. The husband had died of fever 2 winters earlier. The last harvest had failed. Most of their livestock had frozen. She said the children were small and that no one in town had enough to spare after their own troubles. The words stayed with me on the ride back. I kept seeing the image of a house with almost no smoke rising from its chimney. On the way home, I took the lower path that ran along the edge of the valley. The light was already fading when I passed the small wooden house set back from the road. Snow covered the roof and lay thick against the walls. The barn door stood half open, revealing an empty interior. Through one frosted window, I could see the faint glow of a single candle. A woman sat at the table, her shoulders bent forward. 2 small figures huddled beneath a thin blanket on a bench nearby. There was no steam rising from any pot, no movement that suggested preparation for an evening meal. The scene looked like a painting left unfinished, figures waiting in a room that had already run out of warmth. I continued riding, but the picture followed me. It reminded me of another winter, 10 years earlier, when I had sat in my own cold house after my parents were taken by the sickness that swept through the northern settlements. No one had come to the door that year. The neighbors had their own losses to carry. I had learned then how long a night could feel when the only sound was the wind against the shutters and the slow cracking of ice forming on the inside of the window panes. I had made a promise to myself back then, though I had never spoken it aloud. If I ever had enough to share and saw someone else facing the same emptiness, I would not look away. By the time I reached my own barn, the light had gone completely. I lit a lantern and went to the storeroom. I took the fresh loaves I had baked 2 days before, the smoked venison, the last of the red apples, the round of goat cheese, the frozen potatoes, and the jar of honey. I wrapped 2 of the roasting chickens I had been saving for the festival. From the back shelf, I took the bottle of apple wine I had set aside 3 years earlier and never opened. Everything went into a large basket and then onto the sledge behind the older horse. The animal stamped once, as if questioning the late errand, but stood still while I fastened the traces. The wind had risen again by the time I turned the horse back toward the valley. Snow stung my face and gathered on the brim of my hat. As the sledge moved through the drifts, I kept asking myself whether I was making a mistake. The family might not want a stranger arriving unannounced with food. They might see it as pity or as interference in a hardship that was not mine to enter. Yet every time those thoughts rose, I saw again the weak candlelight and the 2 small shapes beneath the blanket. I thought of the promise I had made to myself years ago. I kept the horse moving. The sky was fully dark when the house came into view once more. Only one window still showed light. I stopped the sledge a short distance away and stepped down. The snow reached above my ankles. I lifted the heavy basket and walked the remaining distance to the door. The wood was old and weathered, the iron latch stiff with cold. For a moment I stood there, the weight of the basket pulling at my arm, listening to the wind move through the bare trees behind the house. Then I raised my hand and knocked 3 times. My name is Rowan Hale. I am 38 years old. Until that night, I had lived alone on the northern hills for more than a decade. After I knocked, nothing remained the same. The door opened after a long silence. It moved only a few inches at first, then a little more, as though whoever stood on the other side needed time to decide whether opening it was wise. A woman looked out at me through the narrow gap. She was tall, even for an orc, with black hair pulled back low at the nape of her neck. Her face was thinner than it should have been, the lines around her eyes deeper than her years. She wore a faded wool tunic and a leather vest that had seen hard use. Her eyes, the color of dark river stone, studied me without warmth. Behind her, 2 small faces appeared. A girl, perhaps 8, peered around her mother's side. A boy, no more than 5, stood half hidden by the door frame, one hand clutching the edge of his mother's tunic. Both children were orc, with the same green skin and the same dark hair, though the boy's was shorter and uneven, as if someone had cut it with a knife in a hurry. I lifted the basket slightly so she could see what it held. "I have more food than I need this year," I said. The words sounded thin even to my own ears. She did not answer at once. Her gaze moved from my face to the basket, then back again. She knew I was lying. A man who lived alone on the northern hills did not need 2 roasting chickens and a bottle of good apple wine for a festival he planned to spend by himself. Still, she did not close the door. The boy, the smaller one, stared at the basket with open hunger. His eyes were fixed on the rounded shape of the chicken wrapped in cloth. He swallowed once, hard, and then looked up at his mother without speaking. The girl said nothing either, but her hand had come to rest on her mother's arm. The woman's name was Valra Mornstone. She told me later after the door was already open and I was inside. At that moment, she only stepped back half a pace and said, in a voice that carried both weariness and caution, "Come in, before you freeze on the step." The house was colder inside than I'd expected. The single room served as kitchen, living space, and sleeping quarters. A low hearth held a few glowing coals that gave almost no heat. 3 wooden plates sat on the table, empty. A thin blanket lay folded on a bench near the wall. The air smelled of damp wood and old ash and the particular emptiness that comes when a fire has not been properly fed for days. I set the basket on the table and knelt at the hearth. The woodpile beside it was small. I added what was left of it and blew gently on the coals until a flame caught. Valra watched me without moving. The girl, Nira, came closer after a moment and picked up a pot without being asked. She carried it to the table and set it down. The boy, Davin, stayed where he was, still staring at the wrapped chicken. I unwrapped the birds and set them on the iron spit that leaned against the wall. While the meat began to warm, I sliced the bread and the smoked venison. Nira brought water from a bucket near the door and poured it into the pot. I added the frozen potatoes and a pinch of salt I had brought from my own stores. The smell of the cooking meat slowly pushed back the colder scents of the room. Valra remained standing near the table for a long time. She did not offer to help, but she did not leave the room either. Once when Dovin reached toward the chicken before it was ready, she spoke his name quietly and he drew his hand back. He did not complain. He simply sat on the bench and continued to watch. When the food was ready, I carried the pot to the table and set the roasted chickens on the wooden board I found leaning against the wall. Steam rose from the potatoes. The bread, warmed near the fire, gave off a faint sweetness. I poured a little of the apple wine into 3 small cups I found on a shelf and set the 4th cup aside for myself. Valra looked at the spread for a moment longer than necessary. Then she lowered her head slightly and said, "Thank you." I answered without thinking, "Don't thank me as though I were a stranger." She lifted her eyes to mine. Something in them shifted, though I could not name it. We ate without much speaking at first. Davin ate with both hands, sauce gathering at the corners of his mouth. Nira ate more slowly, but her eyes kept returning to the chicken as if she expected it to disappear. Valra ate last. She cut small pieces for the children before taking any for herself. When she finally tasted the meat, she closed her eyes for a brief moment. It was the only sign she gave that the food meant more than simple nourishment. After a while, the silence changed. It was no longer the silence of people who had nothing to say. It became the silence of people who were listening to the sound of chewing and the crack of the fire and the small movements of 3 bodies that had not expected to share a table that night. Dovin laughed once when a piece of potato fell from his spoon onto his lap. Nira smiled at him. Valra reached over and wiped his face with the edge of her sleeve. The gesture was ordinary, but it was the first ordinary thing I had seen in that house. I sat across from them and watched. The warmth from the fire reached my face and hands. The smell of the meal still hung in the air. For the first time in many years, I was not eating alone while the wind moved around the outside of a stone house that held only one person. When the plates were empty, Dovin slid off the bench and came around the table. He stopped beside my chair and looked up at me with eyes that were already heavy with sleep. He tugged once on the sleeve of my coat. "Mr. Rowan," he said. His voice was small. "Will you come again next year?" I looked at him. Then I looked across the table at Velra. She was standing now, one hand resting on the back of Nira's chair. The firelight moved across her face. She did not answer for me. She only waited. I did not know what to say. The words that came were quieter than I intended. "I don't know yet." Dovin nodded as though that answer was enough. He leaned against my arm for a moment, then walked back to the bench and climbed onto it. Within a few minutes, his head had dropped onto Nira's shoulder. Nira did not push him away. She simply sat still so he would not slip. Velra walked with me to the door when I rose to leave. The night outside was colder than before, the snow still falling in steady lines. She stood in the doorway while I stepped out onto the step. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, very low, "You did not have to do this." "I know," I answered. She looked past me at the sledge and the horse standing in the snow. When she spoke again, her voice was even quieter. "The children will remember tonight." I nodded. There was nothing else to say that would not sound like a promise I was not ready to make. I turned and walked back to the horse. The basket was lighter now. The wind had not stopped. As I drove the sledge up the slope toward the northern hills, I kept seeing the same picture. The small room, the fire that had finally caught, the two children sitting close together, and Vaelra standing at the table with her hand on the back of a chair. My own house waited for me at the top of the ridge. It would be dark and cold when I arrived. I had lived in that cold for a long time without complaint. Tonight, for the first time, I noticed how empty the thought of returning there felt. The next morning, I returned before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. The sledge carried a load of split firewood, a small bundle of dried herbs I kept for winter coughs, and 2 sacks of barley from my own stores. I had not planned to come back so soon. I told myself it was only to make sure the fire had lasted through the night and that the children had eaten. The truth was simpler. I had not been able to stop thinking about the small wooden house and the way the light had moved across Velra's face when she finally smiled. She opened the door before I could knock. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the loaded sledge, then narrowed. She stepped outside and closed the door behind her so the children would not hear. "You do not owe us anything," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tightness in it I had not noticed the night before. "I know," I answered. She looked at the wood, at the sacks, at the small packet of herbs. For a moment, she seemed to weigh whether to send me away. Then she stepped aside without another word and let me carry everything inside. I spent the morning repairing what I could see needed fixing. The eastern fence had collapsed under the weight of snow and ice. I reset the posts and strung new wire between them while the cattle watched from a distance. Velra worked nearby, chopping what little wood remained in their pile. She did not ask for help, but she did not tell me to leave either. When I finished the fence, I moved to the goat shed. The roof sagged where several planks had rotted. I replaced them one by one, working slowly so the noise would not disturb the children inside. By midday, the well pulley had frozen solid. I built a small fire beside it and thawed the mechanism until it turned again. Velra came out with a bucket and watched me work without speaking. When the rope finally moved freely, she lowered the bucket herself and drew up water. She poured some into a second bucket and carried both toward the house. Before she reached the door, she stopped and looked back at me. "You will make them expect things," she said quietly. I wiped my hands on my trousers. "Perhaps I'm expecting things too." She studied me for a long moment, then carried the water inside. That evening, I stayed for the meal. It was not planned. I simply did not leave when the light began to fade. Nira helped me peel the last of the potatoes I had brought. Dovin sat on the bench and swung his legs, watching everything with serious eyes. Valra cooked in silence, but she set 4 plates on the table instead of 3. After we ate, the children did not go to their sleeping corner right away. Nira asked if I knew any stories about the white wolves that lived higher in the mountains. I told her what I had seen once, years earlier, when a pack had crossed the northern ridge during a hard winter. She listened without interrupting, her chin resting on her folded arms. Dovin climbed onto the bench beside me and leaned against my side. Before I reached the end of the story, his head had grown heavy against my arm. I felt the small weight of it and did not move. Vaelra sat across from us, mending a tear in Nira's sleeve by the light of the fire. She worked slowly, her needle moving in steady stitches. Every so often she glanced up, not at me, but at the way Dovin had settled against my coat. She did not smile, but something in her shoulders eased. I returned the following evening, and the one after that. The pattern formed without either of us naming it. I brought wood when their pile grew low. I repaired what broke. In return, I was given a place at their table, and the sound of voices that were not my own. The stone house on the northern hill began to feel less like a home and more like a place I visited between visits to the valley. One night, after the children had fallen asleep, I walked back up the slope alone. The wind had dropped, and the snow lay smooth and unbroken under the stars. When I opened the door of my own house, the cold inside met me like an old acquaintance. I lit the lamp and stood in the single room. The table was exactly as I had left it. The chair sat in its usual place. The bed was made with the same gray blanket. Nothing had changed, yet the room felt smaller than I remembered and emptier. There was no low voice asking if the fire needed another log. There were no small feet padding across the floorboards. I stood there longer than I needed to, then blew out the lamp and lay down without removing my coat. The next evening, when I rose to leave after the meal, Vaelra followed me to the door. She stepped outside with me and pulled the door closed behind her so we would not wake the children. For a while we stood on the narrow porch, our breath visible in the cold air. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked. The question was not sharp. It was tired and honest. I looked out at the dark line of trees beyond the fence. 10 years ago, I sat in a house like this one after my parents died. No one came to the door. I told myself then that if I ever had enough to share, I would not look away from someone else sitting in the same cold. She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. "That is not the only reason." I turned to look at her. The light from the single window touched the side of her face. "No," I said. "It is not." She nodded once, as if that answer was enough for now. She reached for the door handle, then paused. "Rowan," she said. I waited. "Thank you for coming back." She went inside and closed the door before I could answer. I stood on the step a moment longer, listening to the soft sounds of the house settling for the night. Then I turned and walked toward the sledge. The path up the hill felt longer than usual, but for the first time in many winters I did not mind the cold. The winter showed no sign of loosening its grip. Days shortened into long, gray stretches where the only reliable sound was the wind pushing against the shutters. I began spending more nights in the valley than on the northern hill. Each morning, I told myself I would return to my own house after the evening meal. Yet when the time came, I stayed. The children had grown used to my presence. Nira left a place for me on the bench without being asked. Dovin climbed into my lap during stories as if it had always been that way. Word traveled faster than I expected. One afternoon, while I was repairing the goat shed, a trader passing through the valley stopped to water his horse. He watched me work for a while, then spoke in a tone meant to sound casual. "People in town are saying the solitary herdsman has found himself a family," he said. I did not answer. He waited, then shrugged, and rode on. Vaelra heard the same talk. She never repeated the words to me, but I saw the change in the way she moved through the house. She spoke less when the children were near. She stood farther from me when we worked side by side. One evening, after the children had gone to sleep, she remained by the hearth instead of walking me to the door as she usually did. "They say you are courting a widow, with orc blood," she said quietly, staring into the fire. "They say that is why you keep coming here." I stood near the table, my hands still cold from the wood I had carried in. "I have not courted anyone." She turned then, Her face was calm, but her eyes held something guarded. "The children have begun to wait for you. They ask when you will come. I do not want them to learn how quickly hope can be taken away." I understood what she was not saying. She had already buried one husband. She had already watched her children learn to live without a father. Adding another person to that fragile balance felt dangerous to her. "I am afraid too," I said. The words surprised me as much as they surprised her. I had not planned to speak them. She waited. "I am afraid that if I stay too long, I will not know how to leave," I continued, "and I am afraid that one day I will have to leave anyway." Valra looked at me for a long time. The fire crackled between us. Outside, the wind had begun to rise again. "Then why do you keep returning?" she asked. "Because this is the only place that does not feel empty when I walk through the door." She did not answer. She only nodded once, as if accepting the truth of it without agreeing to anything more. 3 nights later, the storm came harder than any we had seen that winter. It began in the afternoon with a low roar that grew steadily louder. By dusk, the wind was driving snow sideways across the fields. We had already brought the last of the goats into the small shed beside the house, but the roof was weak. I heard the first plank give way just after dark. I pulled on my coat and stepped outside. Valra followed without a word. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet the moment I left the shelter of the porch. Snow stung my face and filled my eyes. We fought our way to the shed. One side of the roof had collapsed inward. The remaining goats were pressed against the far wall, bleeding in panic. The smallest one, an old doe that had stopped giving milk weeks earlier, lay half buried under broken thatch and snow. Valra moved first. She climbed over the fallen beams, her boots slipping on the ice. I followed, reaching for the animal. The wind tore at our clothes. My hands went numb within minutes. Valra grabbed the doe under its front legs while I took the hindquarters. Together we dragged it free of the wreckage. On the way back to the house, she lost her footing on a patch of hidden ice. Her body pitched sideways. I dropped my hold on the goat and caught her around the waist. For a moment we stood locked together in the driving snow, her weight against my chest, both of us breathing hard. Her face was close to mine. Snow clung to her eyelashes. I could feel the rapid beat of her heart through the layers of wool and leather between us. We carried the goat the rest of the way without speaking. Inside the house, we set the animal near the hearth and covered it with an old blanket. The children had slept through the noise of the storm. The only sound now was the wind hammering against the walls and the soft crack of the fire. Valra stood by the hearth for a long time after the goat was settled. Her hands were still shaking from the cold. She stared into the flames as if she were trying to find something there that would tell her what to do next. When she finally turned, she crossed the small space between us in 3 steps. She stopped directly in front of me. For a moment, she only looked at my face, searching for something. Then she reached up, placed one hand against the side of my neck and kissed me. The kiss was brief and unsteady. Her lips were cold at first, then warmer. It tasted of wood smoke and the faint salt of melted snow. When she drew back, her hand remained on my neck. "I do not want you to be only the man who brought food on a festival night," she said. Her voice was low and rough. "I do not want the children to watch you leave every evening and wonder if you will return." I covered her hand with mine. My fingers were still stiff from the storm. "I do not want to leave," I said. She closed her eyes for a moment as if the words cost her something. When she opened them again, the guarded look was gone. That night I did not return to the northern hill. I lay on the bench near the hearth, with Dovin curled against my side, one small hand gripping the sleeve of my shirt even in sleep. Nira slept on the other side of the room, her breathing steady and deep. Valra sat in the chair by the fire, mending by the last of the light. Every so often she looked over at us. I watched the shadows move across the ceiling and listened to the storm still raging outside. For the first time since I had knocked on their door, I allowed myself to believe that I might not have to return to an empty stone house at the end of every day. The thought was terrifying and necessary at the same time. I had come here carrying food because I remembered what it felt like to sit alone in the cold. I had stayed because the silence in my own house had become unbearable. Now with Dovin's small weight against my ribs and Valra's quiet presence across the room, I understood that I was no longer the man who had stood outside in the snow with a basket in his hands. I had already crossed the threshold. There was no going back without tearing something open inside myself. The snow began to melt in slow, reluctant stages. Patches of brown earth appeared first along the southern edge of the fields, then spread toward the house. The air lost its knife-edge sharpness, and the wind no longer carried the same weight of ice. I helped Valra prepare the ground for planting. We turned the soil together, working in silence broken only by the occasional question from Nira about which seeds went where. Dovin followed us with a small stick, drawing lines in the mud that he later insisted were furrows. The children changed in small, visible ways. Nira laughed more freely when something amused her, no longer glancing first at her mother for permission. Dovin slept through the night without waking from hunger. His cheeks had filled out, and the constant wariness in his eyes had softened. One afternoon, while we were mending the last section of fence, he looked up at me and said, without thinking, "Chowrowan, can you pass the hammer?" The word slipped out before he could catch it. His face flushed dark green across the cheekbones. He stared at the ground, suddenly very interested in the toe of his boot. I handed him the hammer without speaking. My throat had closed too tightly for words. Valra, who had been holding a post steady, kept her eyes on the wood, but I saw the way her shoulders rose and fell with one long breath. That evening I walked back to the stone house on the northern hill. I had not slept there in many nights. The path felt both familiar and strange beneath my boots. When I opened the door, the cold inside met me exactly as it always had. The single room was unchanged. The table stood where I had left it. The gray blanket lay folded at the foot of the bed. I lit the lamp and stood in the center of the floor, turning slowly as if seeing the space for the first time. There was nothing wrong with the house. It was solid, built by my own hands over years. Yet it held no sound of small voices, no scent of bread baking, no low murmur of conversation from the other side of a room. It was only a structure. The warmth I had carried down the hill with me every evening for months had never lived inside these walls. I stayed long enough to gather a few things I wanted to keep. Then I closed the door behind me and did not look back. On the first warm evening of early summer, I returned to the valley house carrying nothing in my hands except a small silver ring that had once belonged to my mother. The table was already set when I arrived. Valra had made a simple stew with the first greens from the garden and fresh bread. The windows stood open, and the last light of the day came through them in long golden bars. We ate without hurry. Dovin told a story about a bird he had seen that morning. Nira corrected him on 3 details. Valra listened, her eyes moving between the children and me with the quiet attention she had learned to give. When the plates were cleared, I remained seated. The children looked at me, sensing something had shifted. I took the ring from my pocket and set it on the table between us. The silver caught the firelight. "I came here on a winter night because I remembered what it felt like to sit alone in the cold," I said. My voice was steady, though my hands were not. "I thought I was bringing food. That was all I intended. I did not know I was bringing it to the only place that would ever feel like home to me again." Valra watched me without speaking. Her hands rested on the edge of the table. "I cannot promise the town will ever understand," I continued. "I cannot promise the winters will be easy, or the people will stop talking. But I can promise that I will not leave, not unless you ask me to go." I looked at the 2 children, then back at her. "Valra," I said, will you let me stay?" For a moment the only sound was the soft crack of the fire and the distant call of night birds outside the open window. Then Valra's eyes filled. She did not try to hide it. A single tear slipped down her cheek and caught at the corner of her mouth. Nira made a small sound and moved to her mother's side, wrapping both arms around her waist. Dovin stood up on the bench, too excited to stay seated. "Say yes," he whispered loudly to his mother, as if the word might escape if he did not help it along. Valra laughed once, a broken, wet sound, and reached across the table for my hand. Her fingers were warm and strong. "Yes," she said. Dovin cheered before she had finished speaking. Nira pressed her face into her mother's side and stayed there. Valra kept hold of my hand, her thumb moving once across my knuckles, in a gesture so small and private that it felt larger than any vow. Later, after the children had finally been persuaded to sleep, Valra and I stood together at the open door. The night air was soft and carried the smell of turned earth and new growth. She leaned her shoulder against mine without speaking. I looked out at the dark fields and the line of trees beyond them. and for the first time in many years, I did not feel the weight of an empty house waiting for me at the end of any path. I had come to their door carrying bread and meat and the memory of my own long winter. I had stayed because the silence in my own life had become too loud to bear. In the end, it was not I who had rescued them from hunger. It was they who had rescued me from a colder, quieter kind of starvation. The stone house on the hill would stand empty now. This small wooden house in the valley, with its repaired roof and its 4 plates on the table, had become the place I returned to. Not because I had chosen to save anyone, but because they had, without meaning to, saved me.